Hey, this is Shane Long, wedding and portrait photographer based out of Minnesota and Southwest Florida. And today I want to do a quick review for you of my RF85mm f2 macro. I'll be comparing it to my 85mm 1.2 and my 50mm 1.8. We'll take a look at the background blur, the sharpness, the macro ability, everything about this lens. Here we go.
I want to begin this video by looking at the macro ability of the RF85mm f2, as that is the reason I added it to my bag. I wanted an inexpensive option to take ring photos at weddings. For my use and style of photographing wedding rings, the 1:2 ratio is perfect. Combined with the 45 megapixels of the R5, I can crop in a lot if I want to and still get excellent results. I typically stop the lens down to around f8, and the image stabilization of this lens allows me to take handheld photos with shutter speeds around 1/60th. Every minute is important on a wedding day, so not having to set up a tripod saves me time. I'm often working in hotel rooms and other small spaces on wedding days and might not have the room to back up. 85mm is a great focal length so that I can be relatively close to what I'm photographing. Another reason I got this lens, which we'll explore further in a few minutes, is its f2 aperture. It gives me a good portrait lens backup option for my excellent 85mm 1.2. It's critical as a wedding photographer to have other options should gear fail. Prior to using the 85mm f2 for my macro work, I was using the 35mm and 24mm lenses to take my ring and detail photos on wedding days. And though they work really well for that, I was noticing that I had to get really close to the rings to get to that minimum focus distance. And because I had to get really close to it, I blocked a lot of the light and created kind of a black reflection from my camera in the metals of the rings. So now that I can take the photos from farther back, both those problems of lack of light and reflections in the rings are much greatly reduced. Through the viewfinder of the Canon R5, this is what this lens looks like at its minimum focus distance. And here are a few of the photos that I have taken with it of a few different rings. One advantage to having a macro lens is you can get uptight on your details so that even in a room where it might not be the most photogenic, you can still make some pretty amazing photos with even as simple as a pillow on the floor. And after I finish photographing the rings and the smaller details, I'll often work into the florals and take some pictures of the bouquets. This lens does an amazing job capturing those. This lens is light enough and small enough that I don't mind bringing it on engagement sessions and throwing it in as a little macro lens to take some up-close shots of their engagement rings. Now, I am not a nature or insect macro photographer by any means, but while we were photographing, we did come across some butterflies, and so I took a few of them at their minimum focus distance, just so if anyone's considering it for that, they can kind of see how it performs. I compared my RF85mm f2 to my RF85mm 1.2, which is a much more expensive lens, but I just wanted to see for portraits, can it hold up to the 1.2? What do you get in terms of the price for background blur, sharpness, contrast, color? And so I'm going to kind of let you guys just decide as you kind of look through the photos, but I will show a shot and compare it to the 85 1.2 here. Here now we'll do a side-by-side comparison between the 85 f2 and the 85 1.2. Right away from the beginning, you'll notice a couple things. You'll notice that the 85 1.2 has more blur in the background. We'll also notice that the 85 1.2 has slightly different color. So the 85 f2 has a slight pink tones to it, especially noticeable in portraits. my 85 1.2 seems to create slightly better skin color. The next thing we'll notice is the sharpness is actually pretty similar. When we zoom in, I'm very impressed with the sharpness of the 85 f2. Even when we get down into the corners and look at some of the elements, like if we compare the rock that's in the focal plane here compared to the rock that's in the focal plane here, both of them down into the corners hold up really well. Here again, you can notice the color differences between the two. Both of them were shot with the same settings using the same Canon R5 cameras, but have slightly different color renderings there. Here again, you'll notice kind of the same differences. More blur in the background, slightly different skin color. If we zoom in, the sharpness is pretty similar, though this one is shot at f2 and isn't quite as sharp as even this one shot at f1.2. I took these two photos so we could compare the background blur between the two of them. It becomes quite obvious the difference between the 85 1.2 and the 85 f2. If we kind of zoom in and compare the size, you can notice that it is significantly larger here on the 85 1.2 and more smooth. For this test, I wanted to compare the 85 f2 to the 1.2, both at 1.2 and f2, so you can see the difference in the background blur between those apertures. So if we compare, here we have f2 on the 85 f2, and here we have 1.2 on the 85 1.2. Now if I zoom out and I switch the right image and we make that same lens shot at f2, you can see how the background blur changes. And you'll notice it's actually still slightly more blurry on the 85 1.2 at f2. If we zoom in, the bokeh becomes more circular in nature, but it's still larger at the same aperture on the 85 1.2. Both shot at f2. You'll notice this lens is slightly more pink still than this lens, and the background blur is larger on the 85 1.2 at f2 than it is on the 85 f2 at f2. Another difference here, if you look in and we notice the sharpness, if we look at the eye here, the 85 1.2 at f2 is now razor sharp at f2 and now is significantly farther ahead than the 85 f2 is. In case you're trying to decide if it's worth the extra $2,000 to get the 85 1.2, here is a full body portrait, which is where I kind of feel like the background blur really, is useful if you're trying to really isolate the subject from the background. If you don't need this portrait is still phenomenal. You will notice the difference in the color here, so it has some slightly pinker tones, which you can fix in post-processing. In terms of sharpness, this is 1.2, this is f2. They are very similar. No client or no one's really going to be able to tell the difference there. Here now are those lenses at their minimum focus distance. We can see the 85 f2 can focus much more closely than the 85 1.2. Both these flowers were shot at the camera's minimum focus distance, so the 85 1.2 can get this close, whereas the 85 f2 macro, you can get very close. This can create some stunning detail work, which for me and my Canon R5, I can crop in with its megapixels and create some pretty interesting macro work without losing a lot in the detail. Knowing that some of you probably own the RF50mm 1.8 and are considering this 85mm f2 for portrait work, I wanted to take a few side-by-side photos for you so you can decide if it's worth it. If we zoom in, we can peek at the center sharpness here. The 85 f2 is a little sharper in this photo. When we get to the edge of the frame, it's a lot sharper. For a full-length body, the background blur is pretty similar, with the 85 f2 being slightly smoother. Now we'll compare them again here for a traditional headshot, which 85mm is frequently used for as it keeps the proportions nice for the human figure here. If we again check out the sharpness here, especially on the eye, we can see that the 85-2 wins on that, gives you a little extra sharpness there. If we look at the background blur is bigger and more pronounced on the 85 f2 than it is on the 50mm 1.8. Here are some size comparisons for you. You can see the 85 f2 here compared to the 35 and 24, which are practically identical, and the 16mm, which is very similar to the 50mm if you own that lens. If we switch here and compare the 85 f2 compared to the 85 1.2, the 85 f2 is a lot smaller, a lot lighter. It doesn't seem to be built of quite the higher quality plastics compared to the 1.2, but the 85 1.2 is a lot heavier, and I have noticed that when I'm photographing, 10 plus hours on a wedding day, this is getting very tiresome on my shoulder. So I have actually opted now a few times to pull out the 85 f2 in situations where I know I might be hand holding for a long time and trying to capture a moment. The 85 f2 does not come with a hood, which I use on my lenses just to prevent unwanted sun flare on the lens and to protect the lens from dropping or banging against other lenses. I went on Amazon and purchased a lens hood. It was very cheap, and this is what it looks like with the lens hood on that I bought. I'll have a link down in the description if you're interested in getting the hood. I think a needed accessory. Because this lens can focus very up close, I do use the focus limiter at times. If I'm out and I know I'm doing portraits, I might switch it to the 0.5 to infinity. If I'm doing macro work, then I will flip it to the 0.35 to 0.5, and it just speeds up the autofocus quite a bit. The manual focus is very, very slow on this. If I flip it to manual focus, no matter if I change it with the speed of the focusing dial or the rotation angle, it still takes a long time to focus the lens. So typically what I'll do is I'll operate it in autofocus mode, focus it quick so it focuses on whatever I'm photographing. And then when I've had my camera set so that if I turn the autofocus dial in one shot, then it jumps into magnification mode and I can fine tune the autofocus there and take the shot. So that has really helped me out and made photographing details very easy. To test the autofocus speed and tracking ability of both these lenses, so I had my daughter out here on the dock and I had her run at full speed straight at me to see if it could keep her face and eyes in focus. Looking here at the 85 f2, it did a phenomenal job and tracked her running and kept her in focus the whole way here, making sure that she was tack sharp. Looking at the results here of the 85 1.2, it didn't miss a beat and tracked her no problem running full speed at me and kept her face and features in focus there, even at 1.2. I want to conclude by saying that this is a fantastic lens for the price. You can take excellent macro photos and portraits. I highly recommend adding it to your bag. I will have links down in the description, and using those links really helps support me in making these videos.
Thank you so much for watching. If this video was helpful for you, please give it a like, consider subscribing to my channel. I've got a lot more fun stuff coming for you. We'll see you next time.